Thank you, Dr. Rahul. Good morning to everybody in the audience. You have, I'll first confess that I don't know much about biology or medicine. I will be talking about natural language processing, which along with machine learning has a very important role to play in different domains when you are trying to work with data. Because much of the data in most domains, especially in the biological domain, is unstructured. While there's a lot of things that you can do with structured data, so there's a lot of data which is in the form of images, for which computer vision is used. And I see that you have some lectures on that. And there's also a lot of data in textual form. So we will talk about how we can utilize the information which is in the textual form. So much of my talk will be more generic, but it can be applied to any domain, including the biomedical domain. So when we talk about text mining, it is actually a part of what we say natural language understanding, which actually involves identifying important information and knowledge from text data. And when we say biomedical text mining, it is just text mining applied to sources which are relevant in the biomedical domain. Now, let us look at certain important questions that text mining can resolve. All of you are familiar with this search, right? You all do web search, text search, etc. And that is called information retrieval. And apart from search, we have document classification or clustering, document summarization, question answering. These are parts of information retrieval. What we will be more concerned with in today's lectures are on information extraction, which is about identifying structured information from unstructured text. And there are typically in the biomedical domain and in some other domains, there are certain standard types of information, the basic types of information that you want to extract. Firstly, if you want to get information about something, you have to identify what are the entities that you are interested in. For example, you might be interested in genes or proteins or diseases, biomolecules. So you can identify what are the entities you are interested in, and you want to find out the mentions of these entities in the text. And there are various other things that you can do, right? The same entity might be referred to by different names or by pronomial expressions. So you want to do co-reference so that we can say that these expressions are talking about the same entities. You can also do normalization, where you might have a dictionary of, let us say, these are the genes that you know of, they are in the dictionary, and you not only identify the entities, but you try to link them to the dictionary list. Then we have identifying relations. For example, you want to say this drug is used for this disease. So there's a relationship between the drug and the disease. Either you just consider the relationship or you can consider the type of the relationship. So between a pair of entities or more entities, you want to identify the relationship that exists, whether it is a causal relationship, temporal relationship, and so on. For example, in the biomedical domain, you might be interested in knowing whether one gene inhibits another gene, whereas a particular gene is involved in a particular disease, and so on. Then there are other work which people talk about claim detection, where you take a research paper and identify the phrases and sentences denoting the core claim made in the document. And then this is something which is very useful and gaining a lot of traction today. So it is not just about understanding structured information from a single text document, but about reading everything that is out there. We are not, so there is so much, if you just consider research papers, if you consider PubMed abstracts or any other source, there's so much of document, it is difficult for us to read other than a small fraction of this document. But can the machine read these documents, aggregate the information, and identify knowledge from that, which comes from not always a new experiment, but by putting all this information together and by being able to draw inferences. Of course, then you can have medical scientists and biologists who will like to take this hypothesis and test them, and we will look at use cases for this later. Now, just a bit of little information, introduction. There's a lot of textual data in the domain. Genetic data, electronic health records, medical images. Of course, we'll not talk about images today. Then research articles, clinical trial data, then informal sources like blogs where people talk about their experiences and so on. So we have this highly heterogeneous type of data, which are complementary in nature. And what is very useful for us is if we are able to get knowledge or information from this data, and maybe even integrate these information and convert them to knowledge. So, there have been in the biomedical text mining domain, a lot of people have worked and they have developed certain corpus with some test data, with some annotated data, and people have run lots of experiments. This is just, some small examples of those. And these are some applications that people have worked on through biomedical text mining. Gene cluster identification, protein interactions, gene disease associations, and so on. So the overall pipeline you can think of as follows. There is data. There are unstructured data like textual data, image data, and there's also structured data. Then you have analysis systems using various tools, including text mining, machine learning, AI, etc. And then you generate hypotheses. And these hypotheses you then use in different applications. Of course, with experiments to validate, etc., based on the requirements for the domain. So this is some example of basic information extraction that we can do. This is abstract of a research article, and we are trying to obtain the different entities mentioned here. And the entities that we are interested in are gene, purple color, chemical, green color, disease, species, mutation, and so on. And what we are showing is how the system is supposed to identify the entities and entities and label them as different entities. And as I said, you might want to also find out co-referring entities. Now, in standard natural language processing in the classical machine learning domain, the way entity recognition is done is for every entity, you identify the different features, looking at the characters in the phrase of the entity, looking at the surrounding words and so on. And so you look at different features and you use different methods like conditional random field, hidden Markov models, neural networks, and so on. Though today, the way this entity recognition is done has changed, and we will talk about that. Then the other task that I mentioned is entity standardization. So as I mentioned that in this domain, there's a lot of synonymy. The same entity may be referred using different types of expressions, right? For example, genes or proteins can be described with a variety of descriptors, or the gene symbol, or the gene name, or the gene product name, and various others. And there are some examples. I cannot talk about them knowledgeably, but this is a fact. Also, there is polysemy. What is polysemy? The same word or same phrase mean different things in different contexts. Again, there's an example from the domain. P38 is a synonym for over 20 different genes from different organisms. Right? So P38 in human is something else. P38 in a fly is something else. So we need to do the disambiguation based on the context and find out which P38 is being referred to. So this is the task of entity normalization or entity standardization. Then we said that we want to find relations between entities. Now, again, over the history of natural language processing, there have been different approaches for finding relations. For example, through different patterns of regular expressions, identifying patterns automatically by doing a syntactic parse over the sentences. And then, given some examples of relations, you give a set of examples and you feed it to a machine learning algorithm. It will find other pairs having similar relations and so on. And then there are different methods of machine learning, like matrix factorization and so on. Now, you might also want to find out the type of relationship. And what is the range of this relationship? The other thing that I talked about is integration or knowledge aggregation. So you want to get into knowledge networks. So if you can look at, if your machine can look at an entire database and find out the instances of molecular interactions, cellular regulatory events, and so on, based on this, it can try to aggregate that information and come up with new knowledge. And there are different applications. So this is an example of a research work, a little old, where they create biological knowledge networks, where they mine entities and relationship from a big data set. And they've built a graph or network where the nodes are the entities, edges are the relationship, and the edge weights are the confidences on the relationship. And this is utilized for further inference, reasoning, or making hypotheses. And this is an case study. This is a paper reported in 2017, finding melanoma drugs through a probabilistic knowledge graph. So in this work, they found drug, protein, and disease interactions, and they built a knowledge graph of the integrated interactions. And from this, they generated 25 drug candidates, including 4 novel therapies. So these are the candidates that one can explore for as possible ways to work on this particular disease. And they can then go through further trials. But the main point is, through this knowledge network, you have identified a small set of candidates which you can now further explore in your laboratory. Now, that's a brief introduction. And the next part of our lecture, we'll talk about what are the current approaches to biomedical text mining, or rather, in general, through text mining. Now, nowadays, all of you must have heard of different language models, like BERT. Most of you must have heard of ChatGPT, so which you can ask questions and give answers. So we'll try to look at a very high level, how these things work and how this type of technology is being used in this domain. So if you trace the history of text mining using machine learning, in the earlier generation, when we created data sets, we tried to create annotated data set for a particular task through human annotation. And then from this annotated data set, traditional AI or machine learning methods were used in order to learn the function, which connects from the input to the output, so that you can use the function on new data and try to solve a specific task. This was a narrow view of the task. Then we have been working on very large scale data sets, not small data sets which are annotated. Now, if you have very large data set, it will be almost impossible or very painstaking to be able to annotate human annotation of those data sets. So what people have moved on to is self-supervised learning. In supervised learning, you have a task and you create annotated data from the task, labeled data, and from this you learn. Now in self-supervised learning, you work with the raw data, in this case, raw textual data, without annotation. And I will explain that you use a concept of self-supervised learning. You set up a learning task which does not require human annotation. And through this, you build large-scale models. Again, nowadays, as machine learning and neural networks have progressed, the current models that many people use are models based on something we call transformers, which are large attention-based models. So these transformers with many layers and having billions of parameters, they are very useful in capturing the information from these large data sets. And the same model can be now used for multiple tasks. One model. It's not that you have for gene entity recognition, one data set, one model. For protein and for disease identification, a different model. For relationship, another model. You have one common model. And then you can do fine tuning. Suppose you want to do some particular task, right? So you can give a small number of examples of the task. You have this large model, and you can fine tune the model for that specific task. That was the next generation, quite recent, of these text mining models. And the next, instead of fine tuning, one talks about prompting. Right? If you want to do something, you just generate a prompt or you give a question. You go to ChatGPT and you give a prompt and you get some answer. The answer may be right or wrong, but when you are giving the prompt or giving the question, you are not always giving examples of the task. Right? So again, as we will discuss, there is zero-shot prompting, where you have just a task. You say that, tell me what this drug is used for. You just give one question and you get some answer. Or you can give some examples of questions and answers and then ask your questions. So it can be zero-shot prompting or a few-shot prompting. And through that, you get your answer to different tasks. And so what we have today really is a very large model, which is general purpose, or it could be general purpose for the biomedical domain. And then you have small adapters, which are smaller models for each domain, which does different tasks or different. This is how the field has moved very rapidly in the last few years. So with this introduction, let us move on to some more basics. Now, we said we are going to work with language, right? Now, if you're going to work with language, so what is a natural language? When we read or write, we have sentences, and sentences made up of words, and so on. So if you can think of that the basic units, I mean, there are other things, but I'll just keep it at a high level. The basic unit is a word, right? And we have sequences of words which make a sentence and sequences of sentences which make a document. Now, if we are going to work with text, we have to come up with a representation, okay, representation in the computer. And let us see how words can be represented. So for example, suppose this is a sentence. Actually, this is a part of a sentence. So this is the pipeline of NLP. First, you break the sentence up into tokens, let us say words, and you get the sequence of tokens. And now each token you represent as a vector. Okay. Now we want to see how a token is represented. The simplest way to do it is that you take a large corpus, you identify all unique words. And for each word, you give a number, like first word, second word, third word. So you have, this is the 103rd word. Each word has a number in the list. And suppose sequence is the 103rd word, you represent sequence as a vector, which is v-dimensional, where v is the total number of unique words, and the 103rd element of the vector is 1, and the rest of the elements is 0. So this means this is the 103rd word. And this is called a one-hot representation of the word. Now, this representation is not very useful because it ignores the similarity between words. Right? Suppose you take the vector for gene and the vector for protein. There is no inkling that they have some relation. Right? So it ignores the similarity between words. And if the same word, let's say P38, means different things in different contexts, it will have the same vector for them. It doesn't distinguish between contexts. So for solving the first thing, people come with dense vector or dense embedding, where different words are represented as smaller dimensional vectors of real numbers, such that if two words are similar, that relationship will be captured in the vector. So this is the next idea. Now, we'll skip. But before I come to that, let us introduce this powerful idea called self-supervised. As we said that when we work with large data sets, we cannot annotate them manually. So we rely on self-supervised learning. So we take raw data, raw text, and set up a self-supervised task from which we learn. Right? Now, what we are now trying to learn is we are trying to learn the representation of the vector of a word. Now, for that, we set up a task. What is that task? Now, this task is inspired by the idea, by the knowledge that a word, you can infer what a word means if you look at the contexts where it has been used. If there's a word, if a new word that you come across, you might reach for the dictionary. But if you don't reach for the dictionary, if you see the word, hear the word being used in different contexts, you can infer the meaning. Okay, all of you agree? So this idea is taken in, so this is an example of a new word, Tesduino, which we do not know what it means because it doesn't mean anything. But from the context, you can make out what this means, right? Now, based on this, there are two types of self-supervised tasks related which you can set up, either one of them. One of them is, given the neighbors of the words, infer what is the word, right? So you take a sentence, you remove one word, and you try to predict the word. Or the other way around, where you give the word and you try to predict what is the context of it. So these are two examples of pretext tasks. And based on these pretext tasks, where either from the neighbors you infer the word, or from the word you infer the neighbors. Based on this, I'll not get into the details. You learn the representation of the words. And when you learn the representation, you get these word vectors. Now, I will skip the actual mechanism, which is actually quite simple. But when you learn the representations of the words, the vectors, and we have projected these words to two-dimensional vectors, and then you see that similar words have come together, like roll and oven, boil, minutes and stand, yolks, whites, brown, pudding, bake, boil, and so on. If you look carefully, you can see similar words have come together. And then similar words have similar vectors. And this representation also captures relationship. If you consider the relationship of man, the vector for man, vector for woman, vector for king, vector for queen, you can see that man minus woman is parallel to king minus queen, almost. Walking and swam swimming have similar relationship. Countries and their capitals have similar relationship. So this is what you get by applying this simple model on a large text corpus. So vectors know gender, vectors know tenses, etc. So this is the first part of doing something useful with text, learning the representation. Now, natural language processing has different, it's not an easy task. It is a hard task, or it used to be quite a hard task because of certain things. And one of them is ambiguity. Right? We mentioned a simple form of ambiguity, like one word can mean different things, right? But also a sentence, you can parse the sentence in different ways. There's pun. So at every level, so ambiguity is a very major problem in natural. Then sparsity. Like certain words are very rare. You do not have enough information about the words. And then you have variability. The same phenomena you can write or represent in different ways. So these are three major problems in it. Now, if you look at the NLP models, which I've hinted on a little bit earlier, the first initial NLP models were handcrafted, where you give rules that if an entity ends in X and has this sort of shape and its next word is this, then it is the name of a disease, something like that. Then the next generation of NLP was based on supervised machine learning with engineered features. And the third generation of NLP, we don't use engineered features, but we use large data. And then we hinted at the fourth generation, which is based on this large language models or large reading models. Now, let's illustrate these models. So these examples are from different domains, not from the biomedical domain. So suppose there is a sentence which is an input to this machine learning model, and there's a desired output. Okay? There can be different tasks. Based on the task, there's a desired output, and you will have a machine learning model. In the first generation of the NLP or machine learning in NLP, the model parameters are based on the task. Whether it's a sentiment detection task or entity classification task, the models are different, the parameters. And for each task, you had different positive and negative examples to learn the parameters. So this is the first type of model that we have looked at. Now from this, we are slowly making the transition in the last few years to more general purpose. So this theta R is a general purpose model. we call it a reading model. Why? Because this model has come from reading large amounts of text, right? So humans cannot read a lot, okay? But these machines can read much faster. So by reading a large amount of data, it has come up with a reading model, and theta r are the parameters of reading model. And theta r doesn't depend on the particular task. And then along with this, you do fine tuning with a model which is specific for the task, which is called the task model. For example, learning the word vectors that we talked about, that comes from the reading model, right? So once we have a word vector learned, it makes the subsequent task much simpler instead of using one-hot vectors. Now, as NLP has progressed from 2018 onwards, these word vectors came in 2014, 2013, 2014. 2018 onwards, these reading models have become larger. And they have become more prominent with large language models, BERT, and so on. And these reading models come from reading large amounts of data. And they are becoming bigger. The task models are shrinking, sometimes becoming zero, and these reading models are becoming. So this is, a very high level view of how text mining or NLP is progressing today. And just to show that using these big models, so GLUE is a set of different NLP tasks in the general domain, such as corpus of linguistic acceptability, natural language inference, question answering, textual entailment. These are different types of tasks in the NLP domain. And this row shows the human baseline for this task. Right? The other rows are the computer models for this task. So what you can see, I'm not sure if you can see it from the back, but what we see is that the big reading models, like T5, Ernie, all these are Robert, and so on. These are big models. These models have outperformed humans on this variety of tasks. They have become so powerful. So earlier we used to rely on human annotation to learn the task. Now these models, without any extra annotation or very little extra data, has outperformed humans on this task. And then superglue is another benchmark where we also see the same thing. Now, with this background, let us come back to, I'll pause a little bit. So I'll take questions from you or observations before we proceed. Yeah, please.
English, the primary text. Can you have the same model that was trained in English to be used in another language that has different grammar?
Yeah. So that is actually very useful question, and I mean it really needs to be answered. Now, multilingual NLP has been a dream for a long time, and it has become it was initially very challenging, because when you had to create annotated data sets, if you want to do something for Hindi, something for Chinese, something for French, you had to create separate annotated data. So it used to be very challenging. Now there are two things. One is the reading model is based on self-supervised learning. So you don't have to separately annotate data for these tasks. So it can work in any language. You could, that's the first step, that you could apply the same understanding to any language and it will do well in all the languages. But what is much more interesting is that these models, many of these models are multilingual. Like one model that works for all languages. You don't have one language for English, one for Hindi, one for French. You have one model that deals with text from all these languages. And it performs in all the languages. So there are two different frameworks here. One is the cross-lingual framework. In cross-lingual framework, what we do is that we learn the model in resource-rich language, such as English, one or more resource-rich language. And then we find methods to transfer it to resource-poor language, where we don't have annotated data. Right? And then there are mechanisms for doing this, with few examples of the resource-poor languages. And what we have now is a much more powerful framework, where we have a multilingual model. The same model is trained to work on multilingual data. And the same model, in ChatGPT, you can ask a question in Bengali, you can ask a question in English, you can ask in French, you can ask in some other language, and you'll get the answer. So this model is multilingual. It can apply to any language. Of course, the results may vary a little bit, but the main power is having one language. Actually, this was very exciting in 2017. Actually, in natural language processing, machine translation was sort of the holy grail of NLP. People used to do a lot of work on machine translation. In 2017, there was a sea jump in the performance of machine translation, where they came up with a model, multilingual model, same model for translation between multiple languages. So yeah, this model actually works for all languages. Yeah, but of course, the performance may vary, but the overall system can work. One model for all languages. Yeah.
I just wanted to understand how the reading parameters are learned. I understand the theta t.
We'll come to that. We talked about word to vec. We said the reading parameters are learned by taking the neighboring words and trying to predict the middle word. So that is one way in which it is learned. And the more powerful net model will come to that.
Ma'am, the outputs, I think, heavily depends on the quantity of the data collected, right? So if you collect more data, there are also chances of collecting some noise, right?
If you look at single task models, right? If, of course, if you have a supervised model, if the data is poor, obviously the results will be poor.
How do you decide the results?
Huh?
Means how do you decide the success of the results?
No, I'm coming to this. So, in typical machine learning, when there are annotations done, there are a lot of, when people actually create this ground truth data, there's a lot of checking. So there are these, if you have multiple annotators, you give the same task to different annotators, and you find out the inter-annotator agreement or kappa score. Right? So you want to make sure that these annotators, this data can be trusted. Of course, as you have mentioned, if the data cannot be trusted, then what you learn from that data cannot be trusted. That is one thing. The second answer is that when you have these general purpose models, they're learned from data, right? Obviously, and these models are very good. If you use ChatGPT, they'll give you lots of answers. But all the answers are not factually correct. So people also say that, it hallucinates. It basically is made to complete your sentence. You're saying something about somebody. You say, you give a Just to take an example, you give some biodata of somebody, say Dr. Sudha, she does this, and then you say, tell us more about what she does. And it will come up with what more she has done. And some of these things she has not done. So basically, it will try to see a person with this sort of background, what are the typical things or typical accolades there are, not typical things that she does. Right? So it can hallucinate. It can try to complete, but you cannot trust. Okay. Now, if you want to have trust, you have to have other models where you have to verify, where you have to find out, if you take a particular fact that the model has delivered, you have to find out where it has come from to build confidence. So there are all these issues which are there. And these models also suffer from various issues that the original data suffers from. For example, if you say gender bias or discrimination, whatever is in the data, because your reading model is learning from the data, whatever the data has, that is replicated and strengthened in the new data. So there are all these possible pitfalls.
Ma'am, but wouldn't it be better if there's some domain knowledge is to be included in that, and not entirely dependent on the data, but domain knowledge, some kind of feedback is there?
No, you are absolutely right. You cannot solve everything by a general purpose model. Just like I cannot talk about biology, you can only do what you can, but these are tools which can be used by people who have the domain knowledge. The point is the earliest generation, 1950s to 1980s, 90s, people relied solely on domain knowledge to build these models. But the sad reality is that it is very difficult to translate all the domain knowledge of the expert into these rules. And the systems which were built based upon this domain knowledge, first of all, they were never complete. Secondly, they were not portable. They could not, something that you do for one particular entity, you cannot transfer to another entity. So lots of problems were there. People were not able to just build models which were successful and scaled up based on domain knowledge alone. So people came to machine learning. Of course, as you have mentioned, machine learning has this pitfalls because it doesn't understand the domain. So, but it can give you some lead, right? And so there are various approaches. People try to have, different domains. They have a physics guided approach or chemistry guided approach where the machine learning model and the domain models, they work together to do the inference. Third is that third way around is the machine learning model gives you some candidates. And you use your domain knowledge now to narrow down your search. If you want to look for drugs for a particular cancer, if you start from nothing, each trial will take such a long time and you don't a lot of cost. So if you can narrow down your search, get some candidates, now you can verify them with your domain knowledge or with your wet labs and so on. So domain knowledge absolutely is very useful, but in order to have systems that are generalized, that can scale up, one needs to use other tools which can help you now to apply your domain knowledge more effectively. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just like these models are trained, also like models are multi-purpose. It can be trained in, say, for example, the same model can work in different languages. Mathematics has known to have its own language, so same model can be used to solve problems because different problem, like there is a pattern in which most of the mathematical equation could be solved.
So that's a question or observation?
Yeah, question as in, can we do that with mathematical equation, or is that limitation?
Yes, you can go to ChatGPT, ask them a mathematics question. Sometimes it will get it right, and sometimes it will get it wrong. And the way it will get it wrong is very stupid ways. So you give a standard arithmetic questions, or more difficult questions. Doesn't matter. Sometimes it will give you the right answer, sometimes it will not. because it doesn't have a specific arithmetic module built in. It just tries to do pattern matching. So sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it fails, right? So as he has pointed out, you could make it better. If you just wanted to do certain types of problems, you could give more examples of that type of problem so that it learns to do, you can verify, etc. But we cannot ignore the power of large general purpose models that are not given anything specific to a particular domain, but given everything that is there, all the data that is there, trillions of words of data, right? So they achieve a certain level of competence. But definitely you cannot trust whether the arithmetic is correct, whether this problem is done correctly. Sometimes they're correct. So, lots of people do this as an exercise or just as fun. You take a question paper, you give it to ChatGPT, you find out how much it scores. And you are very happy that in my exam, it doesn't score well. But so people have done all these sorts of experiments. Right? So it's true that it will not always work, it will fail. But it is very surprising that when it does work, or when it doesn't work also the way it partially works, that also tells us a lot. And that also tells us how it helps.
Thank you for your talk. And my question is, how does this model bring like new innovation and like do writing stuff and, have things which has not been trained, but it can come up with innovative like add lines or something like that?
Well, it does quite a good job of being creative. And I have not yet come to the model. I'm going to come to the latest models now or the next hour. Of course, if you say when you innovate, you don't innovate in thin air. When you create art, you don't start with nothing and just put random things. It is based on understanding what is the grammar of art, what is good art, what is a good poem, etc. So, and there are examples of that. And when these systems innovate, these general purpose models, whether it's for vision or for text, they are good. For example, you can say, write a poetry in the style of Wordsworth or the style of Rabindranath Tagore on this topic, or draw a picture on this composition in the style of Jamini Roy or in the style of Rembrandt, and it will give you some things. So these models are quite creative. There's a market for AI generated art. You can try AI generated poems. So, it does innovate, it does get things. And people are also trying to find out, is it AI generated? You get 0 in your homework. And then some person says that I actually did it myself. And my school's AI said that it is 80% AI generated. Actually, it's 100% written by me. So all these dilemmas people are now coming up as these models come into being. And it's time to see how it settles down, how we cope with that. But these models are very creative, and how they work, how they are becoming creative, we'll discuss. Of course, that is where it gets knowledge from. It doesn't have consciousness, it's a machine. All that it has is previous information. How it differs from us, we have a limited view of previous information because we cannot read so fast, we cannot absorb so fast. So because they're machines, they can access a lot of previous information, and they can manipulate the parameters of their model. And they have huge number of parameters, billions of parameters, through which they try to digest the previous information. And maybe based on that, they're able to generate new data. So if there is no data, we will not have much time in this part. We have another hour at 12 o'clock. So just a quick preview of what is going to come. We have seen that the word-to-vec models based on learning word vectors actually, they brought about quite a bit of change in the success of NLP systems. When these word-to-vect methods were used in 2013-14, there was quite a bit of leap in the NLP methods. The second leap came in the next step of representation, which is based on contextual representation of words. Like when you build up a representation of a word, you build that representation not just saying that the word sequence has this representation. You say the word sequence in this context has this representation. And the second aspect that they were able to solve is dealing with new words. When we deal with text, natural language text, natural language is very creative. It's very open. People keep adding new words. Right? So earlier systems were not able to deal efficiently or effectively with new words. These newer models come up with encoding of a word based on the subwords or the characters, right? So that even if you come up with a new term based on this representation, they can deal with unknown words. Even if it is a known word, because if you take a trillion word corpus, if you look at all unique words, the number of unique words is going to be huge. And if you are dealing with representing each unique word, your system is going to be very inefficient. So they are able to deal with unknown words, large vocabulary, and also to answer Dr. Sudha's question, they also have multilingual capabilities. So they have not only words in Hindi, words in English, but they have subwords in the multilingual. You take an English word and a French word, maybe there are certain parts of it is common. By having this representation, if the script is the same, or even if it is not the same, but these multilingual subwords. This brings new power to this model. And so what we have, suppose all of us know that the bank, bank is an example of a word. Most common words have this capacity that they have multiple meanings. So bank is one such word. When you say money in the bank, or the river bank, or the blood bank, the word bank means different things in different contexts. So what we have in contextualized representation, that the representation of bank here, here, and here will be different because their contexts are different. And based on this, we have several useful models based on an architecture called the transformer. I will not talk about architectures in this particular course unless you have some question. So there are models based on the transformers, and there are pre-trained models such as BERT by Google or GPT by OpenAI that utilize this transformer architecture, that are trained in a self-supervised manner from huge amounts of raw text, which come up with these representations. And using these models, one can solve a multitude of problems, which we will see in the next. Okay. Now, BERT and models like BERT is just one example, are based on something which is called an encoder representation. You have a sequence of words as input, and what BERT will give you is the representation of the sequence of words at the output, where each word is based on the representation of all its context. A second type of model, which is utilized in GPT from OpenAI, is a decoder of transformer, where you try to get a representation of a word based on the representations of the previous words, right? And GPT type of models are very useful as generative models. Though they can be used for various tasks, BERT type of models based on encoder are good at finding representations And decoder type of models are good at generating. If you want to generate new poems, new text, new essay, you can use this type of models more effectively. There's a third type of model, which is based on both encoder and decoder. And they can be used for tasks, effectively for tasks such as machine translation or summarization or question answering, where both encoder and decoder are required. And these models, BERT was released in 2018. And since then, we have had a lot of models, and they led to significant improvements in virtually every area. And we'll talk about the basics of these models in the next hour.
You talked about the word bank. It has many meanings in different sentences. So initially you were talking about a matrix for different words to be accumulated in different areas, like similar words will be in same region. So what about this word bank and blood and the other one river?
So all these characteristics will be there when we train it on large data sets. Right? We actually, for BERT type of models, we start with word vectors. These word vectors initially are context independent. There we already have, whatever we know about words that we put as the initial input. So these models, in addition, they also maintain, they have, I don't know how they maintain, because for every word, they have a billion parameters. So it's not clear, earlier we used to say this is a vector, which is a 200-dimensional vector. We can see the vector for blood, vector for bank, take a Euclidean distance or cosine distance, see how close they are. We could do that. But here, the model is very large, right? So it's not, so for bank, it's not just this word. So this has come from this entire model. This, the representation of bank in these three contexts is not one vector. It has come from all the parameters in the model. Earlier in the word vector, we can create a dictionary. For this word, this is the vector. We cannot do it because we feed the entire document. And then for every word, we get a vector. And this vector comes from all the parameters which are there in the model. And these large models often have billions of parameters. So yeah, so they capture all this. They capture a lot of things.
Thank you.
In multilingual models, is it the understanding of a model of like different languages in its own primary language? That's why the accuracy varies.
It appears so. For example, when you have, Google Neural Machine Translation, which was released sometime in 2017, I think, 17 or 18. So it was trained on different pairs of language. Suppose Japanese Portuguese is a pair on which it was not trained. It was trained on Japanese English. It was trained on French Portuguese, English Portuguese, and so on. And it also worked in Japanese Portuguese because the overall model is, there is some component of it which is language independent. That's what we like to think. There's a component of the model for translation which is language independent, which works for all languages. So it's able to capture these patterns which are invariant across languages. That is what we like to hypothesize. Okay. So if you're trying to find an entity and you are using a multilingual model, so if you can, as I said, there are three types of models: monolingual, cross-lingual, multilingual. In cross-lingual, you build a model for English. You try to then convert it so that it works for Hindi. In multilingual, you have one model which works for all these languages. So the elements of which are invariant of language.
Currently, like they have good translation databases for different languages. So if and also it's also contextual, like they
Right,
can.
that's a context. For example, one of the ways to do cross-lingual model is that to use translation. If you want to do Hindi NER, you convert Hindi to English, use English NER. That's one of the methods for doing cross-lingual.
Which is more efficient and which will be more efficient and like.
It depends on what you have and what you want. Multilingual, of course, is much more powerful. It depends on how much resource you have, how well it comes.
Oh, ma'am, just one. It was a very immersive lecture. So all text sources would have originated from a human writing, right?
Absolutely.
So I was wondering, how would misspellings affect a model like this?
Because if you take, first of all, what is a misspelling today can become a correct spelling tomorrow.
Okay.
So because we are working an aggregate of large sources, if the misspelling is just a misspelling, few people make, most of the places it is correctly spelled, it is handled. And we are working with subwords. So even if a misspelled word shares a lots of common subwords with the original word. So, variations of the word are handled as similar in this model. But if the misspelling is prevalent, language is something which emerges. It's a natural language. It's not a prescribed language. So if misspellings become the norm, then they become the.
On embedded in things. Do they use this?
Today, most of them use this.
Then why are they so useless? I mean, you can't get a decent answer from a chatbot.
No, it depends on, but again, it's possible to have good conversational systems from these large language models. I do not know what they use, because these chatbots are not general purpose chatbots. They are related to a particular domain. So for that domain, you have to train it. So if you're asking questions about a specific domain, about your data set, right? You want to get answers from your data set. You don't want to get a general answer. So it depends on how they are modified to suit your current circumstances. And, of course, I do not know what the chatbots are built. What I can say that today's conversational systems based on this sort of models work well. That's all I can say. I do not know.
Okay, with that, I think we can thanks Sudeshna, and she'll continue later today. And